Hi everyone, it's William with the Grand Duke Dmitri Diary Series. Today we're doing 1939. We're continuing on with the letter written by Konstantin Konstantinovich Grunwald to Maria, Dmitri's sister, in June 1939. So before Dmitri landed here at Chatzal. But it's very useful, I think, to setting the scene, and it's also just interesting, no matter what. So I hope you're enjoying that. Yesterday we did a 1915 diary entry in which Dmitri continued to refer to being plagued by this sense of weakness, especially in the morning. You know, he doesn't come across overall as being very weak because he's doing what I couldn't do. I mean, yes, he was 23 and I'm not 23 anymore, but being outside doing strenuous activities for about 5 hours a day. Anyway, the weakness in the morning is really troubling to him. But that notwithstanding, he's planning a weekend trip to Moscow. It was a Monday, I think, the diary entry of yesterday, the 5th of January, and he had alerted a certain lady named Nastya, I know nothing about her, that he was going to be in Moscow on Saturday. So we'll see what happens with that. Recap for 1939, just really Grunwald ripping into him, saying that he was selfish and evasive and uncaring about his own sister, and also tied up with this person whom Grunwald considered to be very dubious. So yeah, you know how I feel about Grunwald, and I hope you're taking all of this with a big grain of salt. So our cast this time, we have Zbichevsky, who was mentioned before. I think it's Sergei. I stupidly didn't look it up, as usual. And then we have the general. He wasn't a general, Vladimir Wrangel. And we find out a little more information about him that I actually had forgotten. So here we go. Bear in mind, this is Grunwald writing, and he is writing in French. So I've done a translation. All right. As for myself, I recently tried to start a conversation with the Grand Duke. He evaded it, as I expected, with a pirouette. I asked him, among other things, where your Imperial Highness could stay. He responded, why not at Madame Hottinger's hotel? And yet, in parentheses, I don't know if you are aware of this, Your Imperial Highness. He has just rented a fairly spacious apartment on the corner of Avenue Bosquet and the Quai d'Orsay, which will probably remain unoccupied for 10 months of the year. I also spoke at length about all these matters with Zbichevsky, who has taken on the duties of his secretary after the death of poor Wrangel. Based on these statements, which seem to me to be very frank and sincere, based on these statements, meaning the statements made by Zbichevsky, which seem to me to be very frank and sincere, I have come to the conclusion that the Grand Duke's situation is more than brilliant, and that the figure of his debts amounts to only 1 or 2 of his monthly payments. In other words, they are non-existent. It is only goodwill that is lacking, and you alone, madam, can remedy this by your presence. Okay, what a thing to say. Boy, okay. So I don't get really why Grunwald is surprised that Dmitri is being, as he says, evasive. Can you imagine? You have this snoopy guy asking you very personal questions about things, things about your finances, and also trying to get that information from your intimate friends and employees. I would be evasive. Anybody would be evasive. It's so weird that Grunwald thinks that, that it's somehow a shortcoming in Dmitri that he won't talk to him about these things. Good Lord, why on earth would he? So one thing he does answer when Grunwald says, where is the Grand Duchess going to stay when she comes to Paris, if she comes to Paris? And Dmitri says, well, why not at Madame Hottinger's hotel? And I don't know what that was. I can find information about a company, an old company in Paris called Hottinger's, and then a bank called Hottingers. Instead of being spelled G-E-R at the end, it's G-U-E-R. I don't know if it's the same family. Both of them have a web presence, but I don't see anything about a hotel. But it's not important, I guess, unless it was a cheap hotel, unless Dmitri was sort of saying, oh, well, that's good enough for her. But what Grunwald wanted to get out of him was an offer for Maria to stay with him at his place. And so Grunwald was not happy to not get that. But again, even if Dmitri intended to invite his sister to stay at his place, why would he tell Grunwald, who's, poking and prodding? This whole thing about the apartment, that, I would have to see some documentation of that. I'm not saying it's not true, but Dmitri's financial situation was not more than brilliant at that time, although he would indulge in certain extravagances. So maybe he did rent this place, but he certainly, when we have his letters to Maria from Schatzalp, and they're talking about Polly and him, he's certainly saying, well, Polly would be living with me in hotels, and if he wasn't in the sanatorium, then Polly would be living with him in hotels during his school breaks. And then later on in the diaries, when he's talking about the possibility of going somewhere if he's released from Schatzalp, that we've already heard that Greece was a possibility, but he also just says, I'm tired of living in hotels. I would be back living in hotels. So if he did in fact rent this apartment in quite a nice area, spacious apartment, then he didn't keep it for very long. He must have broken the lease at some point. Okay, so monthly payments. Well, before we get to that, let's talk about Spichevsky. I think this is even worse than Grunwald poking and prodding Dmitri, trying to get information out of him, to go behind his back and talk to the man who has taken on the role of his private secretary now that Wrangel, the general, is dead. Well, that's just astonishing. That's really, really crossing a line. And that Spichevsky would say anything to him surprises me. But I wouldn't assume, as Grunwald does, that he was responding sincerely. I mean, supposing Dmitri was in financial difficulties, is Spichevsky going to say to Grunwald, oh, his finances are in a big mess? No, he's not going to say that. Would anybody's secretary say that behind the boss's back? I don't know. I mean, draw your own conclusions about that. So he is getting monthly payments. So maybe his financial situation wasn't bad at that moment. I know he had lots of debts, and because there's a done letter that is actually sent to Maria by Dmitri's doctor in London, and there's a woman, an old friend of his, Giselle Marburg, once she married Giselle Pourbrick, that he was very concerned about her husband being angry at him because he hadn't paid whatever he owed, some kind of debt to her husband, Reggie Pourbrick, that he hadn't paid. And I also know, although I don't know the actual details, that he had to have help, financial help, when he checked into Schatzalp. So And then I know that later in the diaries, as you'll see, in 1940, I think January 1940, he talks about, well, now I'm getting my money from Audrey. And so I've paid back Reggie Perbrick and, so on and so forth. And so he is apparently getting these monthly payments from Audrey, or it could be from the sale of Beaumesnil, but I think it was from Audrey, the way Grunwald phrases it, both in this and another instance. So if those were then stopped, remember this is June, and Dmitri checked into Schatzalp in September. So only a short time away, but what happened? Did he then not get his monthly payments in July and August and September, all the way up to January of the following year? And was it because of this? My sense is that it was because of his unwillingness to send Polly to the U.S. I don't know when that whole thing started, but it probably started around that time when it became clear that war was inevitable. And, Dmitri dug in his heels. And, he talks about Audrey in a later letter, in the December letter of his to Maria. He will talk about Audrey giving him an ultimatum, although he doesn't he doesn't spell it out. So maybe there was an interruption in the monthly payments, and then the debts caught up with him, and, he probably canceled the lease, if indeed he had leased this apartment. So, but there's just this period between when Spijewski allegedly talks about how well Dmitri is doing, and then when he arrives at Schatzalp in 1939. Pretty short period of time. I'm sorry, in September 1939. There's this period where I'm not sure exactly what was going on and who was right about the state of his finances. But, it wouldn't be so surprising to me, alas, even if it was partly true and he was doing all right financially, that he wasn't going to go out of his way to share with Maria. Because I think he was, at this point in his life, after the divorce, I think he would, it just would have caused him too much anxiety. I think he was too insecure when it came to money. And, so he would spend it on himself, he wouldn't spend it on her. Well, that could be true. And it is what it is. Okay. Let's see. So the main thing that stands out to me with this, just as with the last section and with the video from 1915, is just the attitude that people have towards him. Grunwald may be, maybe it's anomalous, but at other times in his life as well. And Grunwald, I can't remember if it's in this letter or not. I think it's in this letter. Later on, you'll see him saying, well, thank God. No, it's definitely not in this letter, because it's a letter that after Dmitri checked into Schatzalp and he writes to Maria, thank God he'll be under supervision now. So what does that mean? But it just seems like from the time he was a young adult, there was always this idea that he needed to be supervised. And I just don't see why that would be, unless he'd gone back to his old compulsive gambling habits, and then maybe. But anyway, it makes me think of the character of Hans Castorp in the famous Thomas Mann novel that's set here in Davos in the TB Sanatorium. And the protagonist, the Magic Mountain, the protagonist is Hans Castorp, and he is called, it depends on the English translation you get. In the earliest translation, the original translation, he's called Life's Delicate Child. But that particular translator, beautiful literary translator, but you trade beauty for accuracy. Apparently she didn't do such a good job. She made some pretty big mistakes, but beautiful translation. And then in the more modern translation, Hans Castorp is called Life's Problem Child. And so I think that's kind of the attitude that people took toward Dmitri. I'm not sure exactly why. He was a little different, I guess, from other members of the imperial family, and not as conservative, and a little more. I don't know. You know a lot about him at this point. I'd be interested to hear your opinions. Now, the next video we have for a diary entry of, what is it, 6th January 1950 may shed a little bit of light on that. But at some point, people kind of decided that he was not a grown-up in a sense, And I just don't buy that. I think that attitude really hurt him. I could be wrong about all of this. I would love to hear what you think about it. It could be that I'm exercising or indulging in a little projection here, to use a psychological term, because not at this moment in my life, but when I was younger, I certainly had this sense that people looked at me as life's delicate child or life's problem child, and that there are still some people who seem to presume that they need to give unsolicited advice and kind of just assume that, I don't know. I'm also a youngest child, and any of you who are youngest children maybe know how sometimes youngest children in a family are patronized. But I always love to hear from you on any of this stuff. What do we have next time? Well, we have this sort of bombshell in this diary entry about what medical treatment Dmitri was receiving, what specific medical treatment he was receiving, and what that points to as far as what they believed was physically wrong with him. Okay. And when we come back to 1939, we're going to talk a little bit about Dmitri, but more about Leonard. I think, was he still Prince Leonard at that time, or was he Count Leonard Bernadotte? I don't know. Grunwald refers to him as Prince Leonard. I don't know where the stress is on his name. And again, Maria desperately needs money, and Grunwald is telling her, forget getting anything from Dmitri, but then he's going to talk about her possibilities with Leonard. So if you're interested in any of that, it will be one you'll want to watch. And I will see you all next time. I hope you'll continue to watch. All right, bye.